Chapter 1. The Birth of Babylon. In the beginning there was only mud and water. The land between the two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, was nothing more than marshy swampland where wild birds nested and fish swam in shallow pools. But humans saw something different in this wet, fertile earth. They saw the future. Around 3500 BCE, small groups of people began settling along the riverbanks, building simple reed huts and learning to work the rich soil. These early settlers could never have imagined that their muddy villages would one day become the foundation of the world's greatest empires. The transformation began slowly. These early inhabitants, whom we call Sumerians, discovered that the annual floods of the rivers deposited incredibly fertile silt across the land. When the waters receded, crops grew with amazing abundance, but the floods were unpredictable and dangerous. Sometimes they came too early, destroying planted seeds. Sometimes they came too late, leaving crops to wither in the sun. The Sumerians realized they needed to control the water, not simply accept whatever nature provided. This realization would spark the first great revolution in human civilization. Working together, entire communities began digging channels to direct floodwater to their fields. They built dikes to keep water out when they didn't want it, and reservoirs to store water for dry periods. This irrigation system required incredible cooperation. Farmers upstream had to consider how their water use affected farmers downstream. Disputes arose constantly about water rights, maintenance responsibilities, and fair distribution. To solve these problems, communities needed leaders, laws, and record-keeping systems. From the simple need to manage water grew the foundations of government, law, and writing. As their agricultural success grew, these Sumerian settlements expanded into cities. Uruk, Eridu, and dozens of other city-states emerged along the rivers. Each city developed its own ruler, its own patron god, and its own identity. The cities competed fiercely with each other for the best farmland, the most profitable trade routes, and the favour of the gods. This competition drove innovation in everything from military technology to artistic expression. The Sumerians invented the wheel, developed the first writing system using wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets, created the first schools, and built the first monumental architecture in the form of ziggurats that reached toward the heavens. By 2500 BCE, Mesopotamia was a patchwork of independent city-states, each ruling its surrounding farmland and trading with distant regions. Merchants travelled as far as the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan and the cedar forests of Lebanon, bringing back precious metals, exotic stones, and new ideas. The Sumerian cities grew wealthy and sophisticated, but they remained divided. Warfare between cities was constant and bitter. Victory meant controlling more farmland, more trade routes, and more tribute from defeated enemies. Defeat meant destruction, slavery, and the humiliation of seeing your city's protective god carried away as a trophy. Into this world of constant conflict stepped a man whose name would echo through history: Sargon of Akkad. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon began a revolution that would change not just Mesopotamia, but the entire ancient world. Yet his origins were humble beyond imagination. According to later legends, Sargon was born to a temple priestess who could not acknowledge her child. She placed the baby in a reed basket and set it floating on the river, where it was discovered by a royal gardener. The gardener raised Sargon as his own son, and the boy grew up working in the palace gardens and eventually became a cupbearer to the king of Kish. But Sargon was no ordinary servant. He possessed an extraordinary combination of military genius, political cunning, and personal charisma that allowed him to see possibilities others missed. While serving in the palace, he learned the weaknesses of the existing system. The Sumerian city-states were individually powerful, but collectively vulnerable. Their constant warfare exhausted their resources and created opportunities for a clever outsider to exploit their divisions. Sargon also understood that the future belonged not to those who simply controlled one city, but to those who could unite multiple cities under a single rule. When Sargon finally made his move, it was swift and decisive. He overthrew his master, the king of Kish, and began conquering neighbouring cities one by one. But Sargon's revolution was not simply military. He created something entirely new, a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Previous conquerors had simply destroyed their enemies or forced them to pay tribute. Sargon incorporated conquered peoples into his administration, using their skills and knowledge to strengthen his empire. Sumerians, Akkadians, Elamites, and dozens of other ethnic groups found themselves working together under Sargon's rule. The Akkadian Empire that Sargon created was revolutionary in ways that its contemporaries could barely comprehend. For the first time in human history, a single ruler controlled territories so vast that messengers took weeks to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Sargon's administrators developed new systems for governing distant provinces, collecting taxes from diverse populations and maintaining loyalty among subjects who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. The empire required standardized weights and measures so that trade could flow smoothly across its territories. It needed uniform legal codes so that justice could be administered fairly to all subjects, regardless of their ethnic background. Perhaps most revolutionary of all, Sargon's empire needed a common written language for administration. The Sumerian cuneiform writing system was adapted to write Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. This adaptation required enormous linguistic innovation. Sumerian was written using word signs and syllable signs, but Akkadian had a completely different grammatical structure. Akkadian scribes had to develop new ways of using cuneiform symbols to represent sounds that didn't exist in Sumerian. They created the world's first bilingual dictionaries and grammar guides. The result was a writing system that could record not just simple business transactions and royal decrees, but complex literature, scientific observations, and religious philosophies. The evidence for this administrative revolution comes from an unexpected source: the ancient city of Ebla in modern Syria. In the 1970s, archaeologists discovered over 15,000 cuneiform tablets in Ebla's royal palace, dating to around 2500 to 2300 BCE. These tablets revealed a sophisticated kingdom that was contemporary with early Akkadian expansion. The Ebla archives show how Sargon's administrative innovations spread throughout the region. Tablets written in Akkadian using standardized formats appear alongside local Eblaite records. Trade agreements, diplomatic correspondence, and administrative procedures from Ebla match those found in Akkadian sites hundreds of miles away. The Ebla tablets also reveal the human cost of Sargon's revolution. One tablet records a diplomatic protest from Ebla to an Akkadian governor, complaining that Akkadian merchants were using false weights to cheat Eblaite customers. Another tablet describes negotiations over the release of Eblaite prisoners captured during an Akkadian raid. These documents show that Sargon's empire was not simply imposed by force, but required constant negotiation, compromise, and adjustment to local conditions. The administrative revolution was as much about learning to manage diversity as it was about conquering territory. Sargon's successors continued to expand and refine the empire for over 150 years. His grandson Naram-Sin declared himself a god and extended Akkadian control into modern Turkey and Iran. Akkadian became the international language of diplomacy and trade throughout the ancient Middle East. The empire's influence reached as far as the Indus Valley, where Akkadian cylinder seals have been found in major cities. But the very success of the Akkadian Empire contained the seeds of its destruction. The empire had grown so large that communication and control became increasingly difficult. Provincial governors began acting independently, and subject peoples grew restless under Akkadian rule. Around 2200 BCE, a combination of internal rebellion and external invasion brought down the Akkadian Empire. Sumerian city-states in the south broke away and established their independence. Nomadic groups from the surrounding mountains and deserts, attracted by Mesopotamia's wealth, began raiding and settling in Akkadian territory. Climate change may have contributed to the empire's collapse, as archaeological evidence suggests a period of severe drought that disrupted agriculture and forced pastoral peoples to migrate in search of water and pasture. The fall of the Akkadian Empire plunged Mesopotamia into a period of chaos and fragmentation. For nearly a century, no single power controlled the region. Local rulers fought constantly for supremacy, while nomadic raiders disrupted trade and agriculture. It seemed as though the revolutionary experiment of multi-ethnic empire had failed permanently, but the ideas and innovations that Sargon had introduced could not be forgotten. Scribes continued to copy Akkadian texts, merchants continued to use Akkadian weights and measures, and administrators continued to employ Akkadian bureaucratic methods. Around 2112 BCE, a new dynasty emerged from the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. The third dynasty of Ur, as historians call it, represented a Sumerian renaissance that deliberately rejected many Akkadian innovations while secretly adopting others. The founder of this dynasty, Ur-Nammu, proclaimed himself the restorer of Sumerian civilization and the enemy of foreign influence. He rebuilt the great ziggurat of Ur and commissioned inscriptions in Sumerian that glorified the ancient gods and traditions. But beneath this traditionalist facade, Ur-Nammu was creating administrative innovations that were even more revolutionary than those of the Akkadians. Ur-Nammu's most famous achievement was the creation of the world's first comprehensive legal code. Unlike the Akkadians, who had relied primarily on administrative decrees and local customs, Ur-Nammu established a systematic set of laws that applied throughout his kingdom. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written in Sumerian, established legal principles that would influence lawmaking for thousands of years. The code specified exact punishments for specific crimes, established procedures for legal proceedings, and protected the rights of widows, orphans, and the poor. Most revolutionary of all, the code was written down and publicly displayed, making the law accessible to all citizens rather than the secret knowledge of rulers and priests. The administrative revolution of the Ur-III period went far beyond lawmaking. Ur-Nammu and his successors created a bureaucratic system of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The state controlled virtually every aspect of economic life, from agriculture and craft production to trade and religious offerings. Thousands of government officials, organized in a complex hierarchy, administered this system. Every transaction, no matter how small, was recorded on cuneiform tablets. The result was an archive of over 100,000 tablets that provides an incredibly detailed picture of how this ancient bureaucracy functioned. The center of this administrative revolution was the town of Dreham, located between the cities of Nippur and Ur. Dreham served as the central collection and redistribution point for livestock throughout the Ur-3 kingdom. Cattle, sheep, goats and other animals were brought to Dreham from across the realm, where they were counted, categorized and either redistributed to temples and government offices or processed for their meat, milk and hides. The Dreham archives contain detailed records of these transactions, showing how the state managed resources on a scale that would not be seen again until the Roman Empire. Another major administrative centre was Pusrish Dagan, which specialized in managing the kingdom's vast herds of cattle and sheep. The archives from Pusrish Dagan reveal a sophisticated understanding of animal husbandry, including selective breeding programs, seasonal migration patterns, and disease prevention measures. Government officials tracked the lineage of individual animals, recorded their productivity, and planned breeding schedules years in advance. This level of bureaucratic control over agriculture and livestock was unprecedented in human history and would not be matched again for over 1,000 years. The Ur-3 administrative system was so comprehensive that it recorded not just major economic transactions, but the daily lives of ordinary people. Tablets from this period list the names of workers, their job assignments, their rations of food and clothing, and even their personal relationships. We know from these records that the state employed thousands of weavers, most of whom were women, who produced textiles in government workshops. We know that the state provided education for selected children, training them to become scribes and administrators. We know that the state maintained detailed genealogical records, tracking family relationships across multiple generations. But this remarkable bureaucratic machine was also incredibly fragile. The system depended on a constant flow of tribute and taxation from across the kingdom. When agricultural production declined due to drought or warfare, the entire system began to break down. The detailed records that are the system's greatest legacy also reveal its ultimate failure. In the final years of the Ur-3 period, the tablets show growing evidence of the crisis. Tax collections fell short of expectations, workers received reduced rations, and government projects were abandoned incomplete. The end came around 2004 BCE, when nomadic Amorite tribes from the Syrian desert began migrating into Mesopotamia in large numbers. Unlike previous invasions, which had been primarily military raids, the Amorite migration was a gradual process of settlement and integration. Amorite families established themselves in Mesopotamian cities, adopting local customs while maintaining their own tribal identities. Amorite leaders married into established Mesopotamian families and gradually took control of local governments. The Ur-3 state, weakened by internal economic problems, could not resist this slow-motion conquest. The Amorite takeover represented a fundamental shift in Mesopotamian civilization. Previous ruling classes had been urban-based and literate, drawing their power from control of cities and their surrounding agricultural territories. The Amorites came from a nomadic background where leadership was based on personal charisma, tribal loyalty, and military prowess. They brought with them different concepts of kingship, different religious practices, and different social structures. Most importantly, they spoke a Semitic language related to Akkadian, but distinct from both Akkadian and Sumerian. The transition from Sumerian to Amorite rule was not simply a matter of political conquest, it represented a cultural revolution that affected every aspect of Mesopotamian life. Amorite rulers adopted Mesopotamian administrative practices but modified them to suit their own needs and preferences. They patronized Mesopotamian temples, but introduced new religious festivals and ceremonies. They commissioned Mesopotamian scribes to write in Akkadian, but gradually replaced Sumerian with Akkadian as the primary language of government and commerce. One of the most important Amorite leaders was Sumu Abum, who established control over the small city of Babylon around 1894 BCE. Babylon had been a relatively minor settlement during the Ur-III period, overshadowed by larger cities like Ur, Uruk and Nippur. But Sumu Abum recognized that Babylon's location at the intersection of major trade routes gave it strategic importance. The city sat at the narrowest point between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, making it a natural crossing point for merchants travelling between northern and southern Mesopotamia. Sumu Abum's establishment of the first Babylonian dynasty marked the beginning of Babylon's rise to greatness, but it was a gradual process that took several generations to complete. The early Babylonian kings ruled only a small territory around their city, and were forced to compete with dozens of other Amorite dynasties for control of Mesopotamia. Success required not just military skill, but also administrative competence, diplomatic cunning, and economic innovation. The Babylonian kings had to learn how to manage the complex irrigation systems that their Sumerian predecessors had created while adapting those systems to meet the needs of a changing population. Archaeological evidence from Tel Harmal, a site near modern Baghdad, provides insight into how this administrative transition occurred. Tablets from Tel Harmal show Amorite officials using traditional Mesopotamian bureaucratic methods, but adapting them to record different types of transactions and relationships. Amorite legal concepts, based on tribal law and personal contracts, were integrated with Mesopotamian precedents based on royal decrees and temple regulations. The result was a hybrid system that combined the best features of both traditions while creating something entirely new. The cultural revolution that accompanied the Amorite takeover was perhaps most visible in the realm of religion. Mesopotamian religion had traditionally been organized around city-states, with each city having its own patron deity who was believed to rule that city and its territory. The Amorites, coming from a nomadic background, had a different concept of divinity based on personal relationships between individuals and their protective gods. They gradually transformed Mesopotamian religion by elevating certain gods to supreme status, while maintaining the traditional pantheon of city-based deities. The most important religious innovation of the early Babylonian period was the elevation of Marduk, originally a minor local god of Babylon, to the status of supreme deity. This transformation was not accomplished through theological argument, but through political and military success. As Babylon grew in power and influence, Marduk's importance grew correspondingly. Scribes began writing myths and hymns that described Marduk's victory over chaos and his establishment of cosmic order. These texts served both religious and political purposes, legitimizing Babylonian rule while providing a unifying ideology for the diverse populations of Mesopotamia. The period from 3500 to 1894. BCE thus witnessed a series of revolutionary transformations that laid the foundation for all subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerian agricultural revolution created the economic basis for urban civilization. The Akkadian administrative revolution demonstrated that multi-ethnic empires could be successfully governed. The Ur-III bureaucratic revolution showed how state power could be systematically organized and documented. The Amorite cultural revolution proved that nomadic peoples could successfully adapt to urban life while maintaining their own identity and values. Each of these revolutions built upon the innovations of its predecessors while adding new elements that reflected changing circumstances and needs. The irrigation systems that the Sumerians developed were expanded and improved by the Akkadians, systematized by the Ur-III state, and adapted by the Amorites. The writing system that the Sumerians invented was modified by the Akkadians to write their language, used by the Ur-III bureaucrats to record their transactions, and employed by the Amorites to create their own literature and legal codes. The religious traditions that the Sumerians established were incorporated into Akkadian imperial ideology, preserved by Ur-III traditionalists and transformed by Amorite theologians. By 1894 BCE, when Sumuabum established the first Babylonian dynasty, Mesopotamia had become a mature civilization with sophisticated institutions, rich cultural traditions, and advanced technologies. The stage was set for the next great revolutionary period, when a descendant of Sumuabum named Hammurabi would unite Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule and create legal and administrative innovations that would influence human civilization for thousands of years to come. Chapter 2. Hammurabi's Legal Revolution, 1894 to 1594 BCE. The young king who would revolutionize law and justice began his reign in 1792 BCE as ruler of a small kingdom centered on Babylon. Hammurabi inherited a realm that controlled only a few dozen miles of territory along the Euphrates River, surrounded by more powerful neighbors who viewed Babylon as little more than an upstart city. The great powers of Mesopotamia in Hammurabi's time were Larsa in the south, Eshnunna in the east, Mari in the northwest, and Assyria in the north. Each of these kingdoms had armies larger than Babylon's, territories more extensive than Babylon's, and treasuries richer than Babylon's. Yet within 50 years, Hammurabi would conquer them all and create the most powerful empire Mesopotamia had ever seen. Hammurabi's rise to greatness was not the result of a single dramatic campaign, but rather a carefully planned series of political and military maneuvers that demonstrated his genius for understanding the weaknesses of his enemies and the strengths of his own position. During the first 20 years of his reign, Hammurabi appeared to be a typical minor king, content to rule his small territory while paying tribute to more powerful neighbors. He built temples, maintained irrigation canals, and settled legal disputes just as his predecessors had done. But beneath this facade of routine administration, Hammurabi was quietly building the foundations of revolution. The key to Hammurabi's success lay in his recognition that the balance of power in Mesopotamia was fundamentally unstable. The major kingdoms were locked in a cycle of warfare that exhausted their resources and created opportunities for a clever outsider to exploit. Hammurabi began by forming alliances with different powers, playing them against each other while avoiding direct confrontation. He allied with Larsa against Eshnunna, then switched sides to ally with Eshnunna against Larsa. He supported Mari against Assyria, then abandoned Mari when it became convenient to do so. Through these shifting alliances, Hammurabi gained military experience, acquired new territories, and learned the weaknesses of his future enemies. The first major test of Hammurabi's strategy came around 1764 BCE, when he found himself facing a coalition of enemies led by Rimsin of Larsa, one of the most powerful rulers in Mesopotamia. Rimsin had controlled southern Mesopotamia for over 60 years and commanded an army that included contingents from multiple allied cities. The coalition seemed poised to crush Babylon and divide its territory among the victors, but Hammurabi had prepared for this moment by developing revolutionary new approaches to warfare that would transform how battles were fought throughout the ancient world. Traditional Mesopotamian warfare relied heavily on siege techniques, with armies surrounding enemy cities and attempting to starve them into submission. These sieges could last for months or even years, requiring enormous resources and often ending in stalemate. Hammurabi realized that he could not win a war of attrition against larger and wealthier enemies. Instead, he developed tactics based on speed, surprise, and the innovative use of water as a weapon. Mesopotamia's cities were all dependent on river water for drinking, irrigation, and transportation. Hammurabi discovered that he could defeat enemies by controlling their water supply rather than directly attacking their fortifications. The most famous example of Hammurabi's water warfare occurred during his campaign against Rim-Sin of Larsa. Instead of besieging Larsa directly, Hammurabi's engineers diverted the Euphrates River away from the city, cutting off its water supply and making it impossible for ships to reach the city's ports. With their water source gone and their trade routes disrupted, the people of Larsa were forced to surrender within weeks rather than months. This victory demonstrated that technological innovation could be more effective than sheer military force, a lesson that would influence military thinking for centuries to come. Hammurabi's conquest of Larsa was followed by rapid campaigns against his other major rivals. Eshnunna fell in 1761 BCE, Mari in 1757 BCE, and Assyria was forced to acknowledge Babylonian supremacy shortly thereafter. By 1750 BCE, Hammurabi controlled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of modern Turkey, making him the most powerful ruler in the world. But Hammurabi understood that military conquest was only the beginning of empire building. To maintain control over his vast territories, he needed to create new systems of administration, law, and communication that could unite diverse populations under a single government. The evidence for Hammurabi's administrative innovations comes from one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the archives of Mari, a city on the Euphrates River in modern Syria. Mari had been a major power center before its conquest by Hammurabi, and its royal palace contained over 20,000 cuneiform tablets that recorded diplomatic correspondence, administrative records, and personal letters spanning several decades. When French archaeologists discovered these tablets in the 1930s, they revealed a detailed picture of international relations and administrative practices in Hammurabi's time. The Mari letters show that Hammurabi's empire was held together by a sophisticated diplomatic and administrative network that connected the royal court in Babylon with provincial governors, local officials, and allied rulers throughout Mesopotamia. Hammurabi personally corresponded with officials at all levels of government, providing detailed instructions for everything from tax collection and military recruitment to religious ceremonies and public works projects. The letters reveal a ruler who was deeply involved in the day-to-day administration of his empire and who understood that effective government required constant communication and supervision. One of the most significant aspects of the Mari correspondence is what it reveals about Hammurabi's approach to governing conquered territories. Rather than simply imposing Babylonian customs and officials on subject peoples, Hammurabi adopted a flexible system that allowed local traditions to continue while ensuring loyalty to the central government. Former enemies who submitted to Babylonian rule were often allowed to keep their positions and territories, provided they acknowledged Hammurabi's supremacy and contributed to his military campaigns. This policy of accommodation helped prevent rebellions and made the empire more stable than it would have been under a purely authoritarian system. But Hammurabi's most enduring contribution to human civilization was not his military conquests or administrative innovations, but rather his creation of the world's first comprehensive legal code. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a black stone stele over 7 feet tall, contained 282 laws that covered virtually every aspect of life in ancient Mesopotamia. The code dealt with everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family relationships and criminal punishments. It established legal procedures, defined the rights and responsibilities of different social classes, and created a framework for justice that would influence legal thinking for thousands of years. The revolutionary aspect of Hammurabi's legal code was not simply that it was written down, although that was certainly important. Previous Mesopotamian rulers had issued legal decrees and maintained legal traditions, but these had typically been the private knowledge of rulers, priests, and scribes. Hammurabi made law public and permanent by having his code carved in stone and displayed in temples and public places throughout his empire. This meant that ordinary citizens could know what the law required of them and what punishments they faced if they violated it. The concept of public law was a revolutionary innovation that transformed the relationship between rulers and subjects. The Code of Hammurabi was also revolutionary in its systematic approach to legal problems. Rather than simply listing isolated decrees or responding to individual cases, Hammurabi's scribes organized the law into logical categories and attempted to cover all possible situations. The code began with laws governing property and commercial transactions, moved on to family law and inheritance, and concluded with criminal law and punishments. Within each category, the laws were arranged in a logical sequence that showed how different legal principles related to each other. This systematic approach made the law more predictable and easier to apply consistently across the empire. Perhaps most importantly, the Code of Hammurabi established the principle that justice should be based on the social status of the parties involved. The code recognized 3 main social classes: free citizens, commoners, and slaves. Punishments for the same crime varied depending on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. A free citizen who injured another free citizen faced heavier punishment than a commoner who injured a slave. This system of graduated punishments reflected the social realities of ancient Mesopotamia while providing a framework for consistent legal decision-making. The famous principle of an eye for an eye that appears in Hammurabi's code has often been misunderstood as primitive revenge. In fact, it represented a revolutionary advance in legal thinking because it established the principle of proportional punishment. Before Hammurabi's code, legal punishments were often arbitrary and excessive, depending on the whims of individual rulers or the relative power of the parties involved. By requiring that punishments be proportional to crimes, Hammurabi's code limited the abuse of power and made justice more predictable and fair. The original stele containing Hammurabi's code was discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists at Susa in Iran, where it had been taken as a trophy by Elamite raiders in the 12th century BCE. The stele, now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice. This scene emphasizes that Hammurabi's authority to make law came from divine approval, not merely human power. The code thus combined practical legal solutions with religious legitimacy, creating a system that was both effective and spiritually meaningful to ancient Mesopotamians. But the Louvre stele was not the only copy of Hammurabi's code. Archaeological excavations have revealed fragments of other copies from sites throughout Mesopotamia, showing that the code was widely distributed and consulted. The code was also copied by scribes for centuries after Hammurabi's death, and later legal codes throughout the ancient Middle East showed its influence. The biblical laws found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy contain numerous parallels to Hammurabi's code, suggesting that legal traditions established in ancient Babylon continue to influence legal thinking long after the Babylonian Empire had fallen. Hammurabi's legal revolution was accompanied by equally important administrative innovations that created the world's first truly centralized government. Previous Mesopotamian rulers had governed through a loose confederation of city-states, each with its own local traditions and administrative practices. Hammurabi created a unified system of provincial administration that imposed standardized procedures throughout his empire. Provincial governors were appointed by the king and were responsible directly to him rather than to local assemblies or traditional authorities. These governors maintained detailed records of their activities and reported regularly to the royal court in Babylon. The administrative revolution under Hammurabi is best documented in the Sippar temple archives, which contain thousands of tablets from the reign of Hammurabi and his successors. Sippar was a major religious center dedicated to Shamash, the sun god, and its temple served as both a spiritual and economic institution. The temple owned vast amounts of land, employed hundreds of workers, and engaged in banking and commercial activities throughout Mesopotamia. The Sippar archives show how Hammurabi's government exercised control over religious institutions while respecting their traditional functions and privileges. The Sippar tablets reveal that Hammurabi's administration maintained detailed records of land ownership, tax obligations, and military service throughout the empire. Government officials conducted regular censuses to determine the population and resources of each province. They maintained maps showing the boundaries of different administrative districts and the locations of irrigation canals, roads, and fortifications. They kept genealogical records that tracked family relationships and inheritance claims across multiple generations. This level of bureaucratic organization was unprecedented in ancient Mesopotamia and provided the foundation for effective imperial administration. Hammurabi's economic policies were as revolutionary as his legal and administrative innovations. He established a standardized system of weights and measures that facilitated trade throughout the empire. Merchants could now conduct business in any city within the empire, knowing that a shekel of silver in Babylon had the same weight and purity as a shekel of silver in Mari or Lhasa. This standardization reduced transaction costs and made long-distance trade more profitable and reliable. Hammurabi also established standardized interest rates for loans and standardized prices for essential commodities like grain and oil. The economic revolution under Hammurabi was closely connected to his agricultural policies. Mesopotamian agriculture depended entirely on irrigation, and the maintenance of irrigation systems required enormous investments of labor and resources. Hammurabi created a centralized system for managing irrigation that coordinated the activities of farmers throughout river valleys. Government engineers designed and built new canals, dikes, and reservoirs that increased the amount of land under cultivation. government officials allocated water rights and resolved disputes between upstream and downstream users. Government workers maintained the irrigation infrastructure and repaired damage caused by floods or warfare. Perhaps most importantly, Hammurabi transformed the religious landscape of Mesopotamia by elevating Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, to the position of supreme deity. This religious revolution was accomplished through a combination of theological innovation and political pressure. Hammurabi's scribes composed new myths and hymns that described Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos and his establishment of cosmic order. The most famous of these compositions was the Enuma Elish, a creation epic that portrayed Marduk as the king of the gods who created the world and established the laws that governed both heaven and earth. The elevation of Marduk was not simply a matter of religious belief, but had important political implications. By making Marduk the supreme god, Hammurabi was arguing that Babylon should be the supreme city and that the king of Babylon should be the supreme ruler. Other Mesopotamian cities were forced to acknowledge Marduk's supremacy, which meant acknowledging Babylon's political dominance. This religious revolution helped legitimize Hammurabi's conquests and provided a unifying ideology that held the empire together. The cultural impact of Hammurabi's reign extended far beyond the boundaries of his empire and the duration of his dynasty. The legal principles established in his code influenced legal thinking throughout the ancient world and continue to influence legal systems today. The administrative techniques developed by his government provided models for later empires from the Assyrians to the Romans. The religious innovations of his reign shaped Mesopotamian theology for over 1,000 years and influenced the development of monotheistic religions in the ancient world. But Hammurabi's empire, like all human institutions, was ultimately mortal. The system he created depended heavily on the personal abilities of the ruler and the loyalty of appointed officials. Hammurabi's successors lacked his military genius and administrative skills, and the empire gradually weakened as provincial governors asserted their independence and foreign enemies pressed against its borders. The final blow came in 1595 BCE, when a Hittite army led by King Mursili III captured and sacked Babylon, bringing the first Babylonian dynasty to an end. Yet the revolutionary changes that Hammurabi had introduced could not be undone by military conquest. The legal traditions he established continued to influence Mesopotamian law for centuries. The administrative techniques he developed were adopted by subsequent rulers. The religious innovations he sponsored continued to shape Mesopotamian theology. Most importantly, the idea that law should be public, permanent, and systematically organized became a fundamental principle of civilization that has endured to the present day. In this sense, Hammurabi's revolution was not just a political or military achievement, but a transformation in human consciousness that changed forever how people thought about justice, government, and the relationship between rulers and subjects. Chapter 3. The Hittite Shock and Recovery, 1594 to 1155 BCE. In the spring of 1595 BCE, the greatest empire in the world was about to face its doom from an enemy it had never seriously considered. Babylon, under Hammurabi's descendants, had grown complacent. Its armies focused on familiar threats from neighboring Mesopotamian kingdoms, while a new power was rising in the distant mountains of Anatolia. The Hittites had been building their strength for generations in what is now modern Turkey, developing revolutionary military technologies and tactics that would soon shock the ancient world. Their king, Mursili I, was planning the most audacious military campaign in history, a strike across hundreds of miles of hostile territory to attack the heart of Mesopotamian civilization. The Hittite army that marched south toward Babylon in 1595 BCE was unlike any military force the world had ever seen. At its core were squadrons of horse-drawn chariots, a technology that had been developed on the steppes north of the Black Sea and perfected by Hittite craftsmen and warriors. These chariots were not the heavy, cumbersome vehicles that Mesopotamian armies occasionally used for ceremonial purposes, but rather swift, maneuverable weapons platforms that could strike like lightning and disappear before enemies could respond. Each chariot carried 2 warriors, a driver who controlled the horses, and an archer or spearman who attacked the enemy. The horses themselves were carefully bred for speed and endurance, fed on special diets, and trained from birth to respond to their handlers' commands even in the chaos of battle. But the chariots were only part of the Hittite military revolution. Hittite warriors carried weapons made from a new metal that was harder and sharper than the bronze weapons used by their enemies. This iron technology had been developed in the mountains of Anatolia, where abundant iron ore and advanced metallurgical techniques allowed Hittite smiths to create weapons that could slice through bronze armour and shatter bronze swords. The process of ironworking was closely guarded by Hittite craftsmen, giving their armies a decisive technological advantage over their bronze-armed opponents. The Hittite military system was also revolutionary in its organization and tactics. Unlike Mesopotamian armies, which were primarily composed of citizen soldiers who served part-time while maintaining their regular occupations, the Hittite army included professional warriors who trained constantly and lived for battle. These professionals were organized into disciplined units that could execute complex maneuvers in coordination with chariot squadrons. Hittite tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and the concentration of force at decisive points, allowing smaller Hittite armies to defeat larger enemy forces through superior mobility and coordination. Mercilli's march to Babylon was a masterpiece of strategic planning and logistical organization. The Hittite army had to cross the territories of several hostile kingdoms, including the powerful state of Yamhud centered at Aleppo, while maintaining their supply lines and keeping their ultimate destination secret. Mercilli accomplished this by presenting his campaign as a series of separate military expeditions, each with its own apparent objective. His army would defeat one enemy, rest and resupply, then move on to the next target, gradually working their way south toward Babylon without revealing their true intentions until it was too late for the Babylonians to organize effective resistance. The psychological impact of the Hittite approach was as important as its military effectiveness. Mesopotamian kingdoms had grown accustomed to a relatively predictable pattern of warfare, with armies besieging cities for months or years until the defenders were starved into submission. The Hittite strategy of rapid movement and decisive battle was completely foreign to Mesopotamian military thinking. By the time Babylonian scouts reported the approach of a Hittite army, it was already too late to organize traditional defensive measures. The Babylonian army was unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the Hittite attack, and their bronze weapons and tactics proved inadequate against iron-armed charioteers. The actual assault on Babylon was swift and devastating. Hittite chariots smashed through the city's outer defences, while iron-armed infantry overwhelmed the defenders. The great walls that had protected Babylon for centuries were breached in hours rather than months. The royal palace was captured, the king killed or captured, and the city's treasures looted. The temples of Marduk and other Babylonian gods were ransacked, their precious ornaments and sacred objects carried away as trophies. The destruction was so complete that archaeological excavations have revealed a distinct layer of ash and debris marking the end of the first Babylonian dynasty. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the Hittite conquest was what happened next. After achieving one of the most spectacular military victories in ancient history, Musili and his army simply disappeared. They loaded their chariots and pack animals with Babylonian treasure and marched back to Anatolia, leaving Babylon and its territories unoccupied and ungoverned. This decision has puzzled historians for generations, as it seems to contradict basic principles of imperial expansion. Why would a victorious army abandon such a rich prize without attempting to establish permanent control? The answer appears to lie in the nature of Hittite society and the challenges of governing distant territories with the communication and transportation technology available in the ancient world. The Hittite kingdom was based in the mountains of central Anatolia, over 1,000 miles from Babylon. Maintaining control over Mesopotamian territories would have required enormous resources and would have left the Hittite homeland vulnerable to attack from other enemies. Musili may have calculated that the wealth gained from plundering Babylon was more valuable than the costs and risks of permanent occupation. There may also have been internal political considerations that forced Musili to return home quickly. Hittite royal succession was often contested, and extended military campaigns created opportunities for rival claimants to challenge the king's authority. Indeed, Musili was assassinated shortly after his return to the Hittite capital, possibly by relatives who feared that his military success made him too powerful. The rapid withdrawal from Babylon may have been necessary to prevent a civil war that could have destroyed the Hittite kingdom. The archaeological evidence for the Hittite destruction of Babylon comes from multiple excavation sites throughout the city. German archaeologists working in the early 20th century discovered extensive burn layers dating to around 1595 BCE, with evidence of violent destruction including broken pottery, collapsed walls, and scattered human remains. The destruction was not limited to the palace and temples, but extended throughout the residential areas of the city, suggesting that the Hittite attack affected the entire population. Similar destruction layers from the same period have been found at other Mesopotamian sites, indicating that the Hittite campaign involved widespread devastation across the region. The sudden collapse of Babylonian power created a political vacuum that lasted for several generations. No single power was strong enough to unite Mesopotamia under its control, and the region fragmented into numerous small kingdoms and city-states. Trade networks that had connected Mesopotamia with distant regions were disrupted, leading to economic decline and cultural isolation. The sophisticated administrative systems that had been developed under Hammurabi's dynasty collapsed, and much of the knowledge and expertise that had been accumulated over centuries was lost. Into this chaos came a people who would eventually restore order and prosperity to Mesopotamia, though in ways that would have seemed strange and foreign to the Babylonians of Hammurabi's time. The Kassites were a mountain people from the Zagros Mountains east of Mesopotamia, related to the Elamites but with their own distinct culture and language. Like the Hittites, the Kassites possessed advanced military technology, particularly in horse breeding and chariot warfare. But unlike the Hittites, the Kassites came to Mesopotamia not as raiders, but as settlers seeking new lands and opportunities in the fertile river valleys. The Kassite takeover of Babylon was a gradual process that took several decades to complete. Rather than conquering the city through a single dramatic assault, Cassite leaders gradually established their authority through a combination of military pressure, political alliances, and cultural adaptation. They presented themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as the legitimate successors to the ancient Babylonian kings, chosen by the gods to restore order and prosperity to the land. This approach was far more successful than the Hittite strategy of rapid conquest and withdrawal, as it allowed the Cassites to build lasting institutions and gain the loyalty of the Mesopotamian population. The Cassite transformation of Babylonian society was one of the most remarkable cultural syntheses in ancient history. The Cassites adopted Babylonian language, religion, and administrative practices while introducing their own innovations and perspectives. They learned to read and write cuneiform, patronized Babylonian temples, and commissioned inscriptions that praised traditional Mesopotamian gods. At the same time, they introduced new technologies, new forms of art and architecture, and new social and economic institutions that revitalized Mesopotamian civilization. One of the most distinctive Cassite innovations was the kuduru, or boundary stone, which represented a revolutionary approach to land ownership and legal protection. Kuduru were carved stone monuments that recorded land grants, usually from the king to loyal officials or temples. These stones were placed at the boundaries of the granted territory and served as permanent legal documents that could not be easily altered or destroyed. The stones were inscribed with detailed descriptions of the land being granted, the conditions of the grant, and curses against anyone who might try to violate the agreement. The kuduru system represented a fundamental change in how land ownership was conceived and protected in Mesopotamian society. Previous systems had relied primarily on written contracts and oral testimony, which could be disputed or lost. The kuduru provided permanent, visible evidence of land rights that was protected by both royal authority and divine sanction. The elaborate curses inscribed on the stones called upon the gods to punish anyone who moved the boundary markers or violated the land rights they recorded. This system provided much greater security for landowners and helped to stimulate agricultural investment and economic development. The Cassite period also saw the development of new land tenure systems that differed significantly from earlier Mesopotamian practices. The Cassites introduced the concept of hereditary land grants that could be passed down from father to son, creating a new class of landed nobility that served as the backbone of Cassite society. These noble families were granted large estates in exchange for military service, administrative duties, and loyalty to the king. The system was similar to the feudal arrangements that would later develop in medieval Europe, with a hierarchy of obligations and privileges that connected the king to his nobles and the nobles to their tenants and workers. The economic revolution under Cassite rule was closely connected to their expertise in horse breeding and chariot warfare. The Cassites established extensive horse breeding programs that produced animals superior to any previously seen in Mesopotamia. These horses were not only used for military purposes, but also for transportation, agriculture, and ceremonial occasions. The breeding and training of horses became a major economic activity that involved thousands of people and generated substantial wealth for the Cassite elite. The social implications of the horse revolution were profound. Horse breeding and chariot warfare required specialized knowledge and skills that were not easily acquired by ordinary farmers or craftsmen. This created a new warrior aristocracy that was defined not by birth or wealth alone, but by their mastery of military technology and their ability to serve effectively in the king's army. These warrior nobles formed the core of Cassite society, and provided the military strength that allowed the dynasty to maintain power for over 4 centuries. The evidence for Kassite social and economic innovations comes from one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamian history, the Nutsi archives. Nutsi was a small town near modern Kirkuk in Iraq that served as a centre for Kassite administration during the 15th and 14th centuries BCE. The site was excavated by American archaeologists in the 1920s and 1930s, who discovered over 5,000 cuneiform tablets that provide an incredibly detailed picture of life in a Kassite provincial town. The Nutsi tablets include contracts for the sale and breeding of horses, showing how the Kassite horse industry was organized and regulated. The tablets record the genealogies of valuable breeding stock, the prices paid for different types of horses, and the arrangements for training and maintaining cavalry units. They also include adoption contracts, which were actually a form of land sale that circumvented legal restrictions on the transfer of family property. These contracts show how Kassite legal innovations were adapted to meet the practical needs of a changing society. The Nutsi archives also provide evidence for the social changes that accompanied the Kassite Revolution. The tablets record the activities of a new class of entrepreneurs who specialized in horse trading, land development, and financial services. These individuals were neither traditional nobles nor ordinary farmers, but rather a new middle class that emerged to serve the needs of Kassite society. They acted as intermediaries between the Kassite elite and the Mesopotamian population, helping to bridge the cultural gap between the foreign rulers and their native subjects. The religious revolution under Kassite rule was characterized by synthesis rather than replacement. The Kassites adopted the traditional Mesopotamian pantheon while introducing their own deities and religious practices. Kassite gods were identified with Babylonian deities, creating a complex religious system that satisfied both Kassite and Babylonian religious sensibilities. The most important Kassite contribution to Mesopotamian religion was the introduction of new forms of personal devotion and private worship that complemented the traditional focus on public ceremonies and royal rituals. The Kassite period also saw important developments in Babylonian international relations. Unlike their predecessors, who had focused primarily on Mesopotamian affairs, the Kassite kings established diplomatic relations with the great powers of the ancient world, including Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. These relationships were maintained through a sophisticated system of diplomatic correspondence, royal marriages, and gift exchange that demonstrated Babylon's return to international prominence. The most famous evidence for Kassite diplomacy comes from the Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence discovered at the site of Akhetaten, the capital city built by the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE. Among the nearly 400 letters found at Amarna were several exchanges between Kassite kings of Babylon and Egyptian pharaohs. These letters show that the Kassites were treated as equals by the Egyptians, one of the most powerful and prestigious kingdoms of the ancient world. The Amarna correspondence reveals that Kassite-Egyptian relations were based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than dominance by either party. The letters discuss royal marriages, trade agreements and military alliances, showing that Babylon under Kassite rule had regained its position as a major power in international affairs. The Kassite kings addressed the Egyptian pharaohs as brother rather than as superior or inferior, indicating their equal status in the diplomatic hierarchy of the ancient world. The Kassite transformation of Babylonian society was remarkably successful in terms of both longevity and stability. The Kassite dynasty ruled Babylon for over 400 years, longer than any other dynasty in Mesopotamian history. During this period, Babylon experienced a cultural renaissance that produced important advances in literature, science, and art. Kassite period texts include some of the finest examples of Babylonian poetry and religious literature, while Kassite artists developed new styles and techniques that influenced artistic production throughout the region. The military innovations of the Kassite period had lasting effects on warfare throughout the ancient world. The techniques of horse breeding and chariot warfare that the Kassites perfected were adopted by other kingdoms and eventually spread as far as China and Western Europe. The social and economic institutions that developed to support these military innovations provided models for later civilizations, particularly in the areas of land tenure and aristocratic organization. The Kassite period also saw important developments in Babylonian law and administration. While the Kassites adopted the basic framework of Hammurabi's legal code, they introduced numerous modifications and additions that reflected their own cultural values and the changing needs of Mesopotamian society. Kassite legal innovations included new procedures for land registration, new forms of contract law, and new approaches to family law that reflected the influence of Kassite marriage and inheritance customs. The architectural achievements of the Kassite period, while less spectacular than those of earlier or later periods, were nonetheless significant. The Kassites rebuilt many of the temples and palaces that had been destroyed during the Hittite raid, often incorporating new design elements and construction techniques. They also built new types of structures, including elaborate tomb complexes and ceremonial centers that reflected their own religious and cultural traditions. The end of the Kassite period came gradually, rather than through a single dramatic event. By the 13th century BCE, the Kassite kingdom was facing increasing pressure from Assyrian expansion in the north and Elamite raids from the east. The final blow came in 1155 BCE, when the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunta captured Babylon and brought the Kassite dynasty to an end. However, the cultural and institutional changes that the Kassites had introduced continued to influence Mesopotamian civilization for centuries after their political power had ended. The Kassite period represents one of the most successful examples of cultural synthesis in ancient history. A foreign people with their own distinct traditions managed to adopt and adapt the civilization of their subjects while introducing innovations that revitalized and strengthened that civilization. The Kassites demonstrated that successful conquest required not just military victory, but also cultural sensitivity, administrative competence, and the ability to bridge differences between conquerors and conquered. Their legacy would influence Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come and provide important lessons for later empire builders throughout the ancient world. Chapter 4. The Great Shadow Falls and the Golden Phoenix Rises. Mesopotamia's Age of Conquest and Rebirth. 1365. 539 BCE. In the dusty archives of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets tell stories older than any living memory, lies one of history's most dramatic tales of conquest, resistance, and magnificent rebirth. This is the story of how mighty Babylon fell under the dark shadow of Assyrian power, struggled desperately to break free, and eventually rose like a golden phoenix to create one of the ancient world's most spectacular civilizations. It is a tale that spans over 8 centuries, filled with brilliant kings, cunning generals, brutal conquests, and revolutionary changes that would reshape the entire ancient Near East forever. The story begins in 1365 BCE when Babylon stood as one of the great powers of the ancient world, its ziggurats reaching toward the heavens and its merchants trading precious goods across vast distances. But storm clouds were gathering in the north, where the Assyrian kingdom was growing stronger and more ambitious with each passing generation. The Assyrians were not content to remain a regional power. They hungered for domination over all of Mesopotamia, and Babylon, with its wealth and prestige, represented the greatest prize of all. For generations, these two great civilizations had maintained an uneasy balance of power, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, but always rivals. Assyrian kings had married Babylonian princesses, and Babylonian culture had influenced Assyrian art and literature. But beneath this diplomatic veneer lay a fundamental tension that would eventually explode into open warfare. The Assyrians possessed superior military technology and organization, while the Babylonians held the keys to ancient wisdom and divine legitimacy through their patron god Marduk, king of all gods. The first great shock came in 1244 BCE when King Tukulti-Ninurta I of Assyria accomplished what many thought impossible. This ambitious ruler launched a massive campaign against Babylon that would forever change the balance of power in Mesopotamia. Unlike previous conflicts that were mere border skirmishes or temporary occupations, Tukulti-Ninurta's conquest represented something entirely new and revolutionary in ancient warfare and politics. When Tukulti-Ninurta's iron-equipped armies marched through Babylon's gates in 1244 BCE, they brought with them not just military defeat, but a complete transformation of how conquest was understood and justified. The Assyrian king did something unprecedented. He claimed divine approval for his actions by declaring himself the protector of Marduk, Babylon's own patron deity. This was revolutionary propaganda at its finest, turning religious tradition on its head to legitimize foreign rule. The psychological impact of this religious justification cannot be overstated. For centuries, Babylonians had believed that their city was blessed by Marduk and therefore invincible. Now an Assyrian king claimed that Marduk himself had invited the conquest because Babylon's rulers had become corrupt and unworthy. This narrative, carefully crafted by Assyrian scribes and priests, helped to minimize resistance and create acceptance of foreign rule among the conquered population. But Tukulti-Ninurta's revolution went far beyond religious propaganda. He initiated what modern historians call a cultural revolution by systematically relocating Babylon's most learned scholars, scribes and priests to Assyria. This mass deportation of intellectual elites served multiple purposes. It deprived Babylon of the very people who could organize resistance movements, while simultaneously enriching Assyrian culture with Babylonian knowledge and expertise. Libraries full of ancient texts were carried north, along with the human repositories of oral traditions that had been passed down for generations. The evidence for this cultural transformation comes from an extraordinary source, the Epic of Tukulti-Ninurta, a propaganda piece that celebrated the conquest in heroic verse. This epic portrayed the Assyrian king as a divinely chosen hero who rescued Babylon from its own corrupt rulers. The text reveals how sophisticated Assyrian propaganda had become, weaving together religious themes, military victories, and cultural superiority into a compelling narrative that justified conquest as liberation. However, Assyrian control over Babylon proved fragile and temporary. The vast distances involved in governing such a large empire, combined with internal rebellions and external threats, made permanent occupation nearly impossible with ancient technology and communication systems. Within a few decades, Babylon had regained its independence, but the precedent had been set. The Assyrians had proven that Babylon could be conquered, and they would return again and again over the following centuries. The period between 1100 and 900 BCE brought an entirely different kind of revolution to Mesopotamia, one that arrived not with armies and sieges, but with wandering tribes and gradual infiltration. This was the age of the Aramean Revolution, when nomadic peoples from the Syrian desert began settling throughout the fertile river valleys and established cities of the ancient Near East. Unlike the dramatic military conquests that dominated political headlines, this transformation was subtle, gradual, and ultimately more profound in its long-term effects. The Arameans were not a single unified people, but rather a collection of related tribes sharing similar languages, customs, and ways of life. They were semi-nomadic, moving seasonally with their flocks, but also engaging in trade and settling in strategic locations along major trade routes. As political authority weakened in the established kingdoms due to constant warfare and economic strain, these tribes found opportunities to establish themselves in areas that had once been firmly controlled by settled governments. What made the Aramean Revolution so significant was not just their physical presence, but their linguistic and cultural impact. Aramaic, their language, was simpler to learn and write than the complex cuneiform system used for Akkadian, the traditional language of Mesopotamian civilization. Merchants found Aramaic much more practical for conducting business across the diverse ethnic groups of the region. Gradually, what began as a language of trade became the language of daily communication, even in great cities like Babylon and Nineveh. This linguistic shift represented a fundamental change in how civilization itself was organized and transmitted. For over 2,000 years, cuneiform writing and Akkadian language had been the hallmarks of educated, civilized society in Mesopotamia. Now, as Aramaic spread through markets, neighborhoods, and eventually government offices, the old system began to crumble. Ancient libraries became increasingly irrelevant as fewer people could read the old texts, and traditional knowledge began to fragment and disappear. The economic consequences of the Aramean Revolution were equally dramatic. The great international trade networks that had connected Mesopotamia with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau began to break down as political authority fragmented and nomadic groups disrupted established routes. Cities that had grown wealthy by controlling trade passages found themselves bypassed or threatened by peoples who owed no allegiance to traditional authorities. Archaeological evidence from this period paints a stark picture of decline and abandonment across much of Mesopotamia. Site after site shows evidence of reduced population, abandoned buildings, and simplified material culture. The great urban centers that had defined Mesopotamian civilization for millennia shrank dramatically as people either fled to more secure locations or adopted more mobile lifestyles suited to the uncertain times. Yet this period of apparent decline also contained the seeds of future greatness. The Aramean tribes brought with them new ideas about political organization, military tactics, and commercial practices that would eventually be adopted and refined by the established kingdoms. Their emphasis on mobility, flexible alliances, and practical communication would prove invaluable in the more complex world that was emerging. As the dust settled from the Aramean Revolution and political authority began to consolidate once again, a new power emerged that would dominate the ancient Near East for centuries to come. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, beginning around 900 BCE, represented a quantum leap forward in military organization, administrative efficiency, and imperial ideology. This was not merely a return to the old ways of conquest and tribute, but rather the creation of the world's first true superpower, capable of sustained control over vast territories and diverse populations. The architect of this new imperial system was King Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 744 to 727 BCE and transformed every aspect of how empires were built and maintained. His reign marked what historians call the administrative revolution, a complete reimagining of how conquered territories should be governed to prevent rebellion and maximize imperial resources. Unlike previous conquerors who were content to accept tribute and nominal submission, Tiglath-Pileser insisted on direct control through a sophisticated provincial system. The cornerstone of this new system was systematic deportation, a policy that sounds horrifying to modern ears but was considered a merciful alternative to massacre by ancient standards. When the Assyrians conquered a region, they would identify and relocate the local leadership elite, skilled craftsmen and potential troublemakers, to different parts of the empire. This served multiple purposes. It removed potential leaders of resistance movements, provided the empire with skilled workers where they were needed most, and created mixed populations that were less likely to unite against Assyrian rule. The logistics of these deportations were staggering in their scope and efficiency. The Nimrud letters, discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of an Assyrian administrative centre, provide detailed records of how these population movements were planned and executed. Officials recorded the names, skills and origins of deportees, arranged for their transportation and resettlement, and monitored their integration into new communities. This level of bureaucratic sophistication was unprecedented in the ancient world and would not be seen again until the Roman Empire reached its peak centuries later. Tiglath-Pileser's military revolution was equally impressive. He created the world's first truly professional standing army, with standardized equipment, regular training and specialized units for different types of warfare. The widespread adoption of iron weapons gave Assyrian soldiers a significant advantage over enemies still relying on bronze, while innovations in siege warfare made even the strongest fortifications vulnerable to patient and systematic assault. The psychological impact of Assyrian military superiority cannot be underestimated. Cities that might have resisted earlier conquerors often surrendered without a fight when faced with Assyrian armies, knowing that resistance would only bring devastation while submission might preserve some measure of local autonomy. This reputation for invincibility became a weapon in itself, allowing the Assyrians to control far more territory than their actual military forces could physically occupy. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Neo-Assyrian system was how it replaced the traditional city-state structure that had dominated Mesopotamian politics for millennia. Instead of allowing conquered cities to maintain their traditional rulers and customs under loose imperial oversight, the Assyrians imposed a uniform provincial administration that reported directly to the king. Local traditions and loyalties were systematically undermined and replaced with imperial identity and allegiance. This transformation was most dramatically visible in Babylon, the ancient cultural heart of Mesopotamia. For the proud Babylonians, who traced their city's greatness back over 1,000 years, Assyrian domination represented not just political subjugation, but cultural humiliation. Their response would define the next phase of Mesopotamian history and demonstrate that even the most efficient imperial systems could not completely suppress the human desire for independence and dignity. The story of Babylonian resistance to Assyrian rule centers on one of the most remarkable figures in ancient Near Eastern history, Merodach-Baladan, a Chaldean chieftain who twice managed to seize control of Babylon itself and challenge the mighty Assyrian Empire. His revolts in 721, 710 BCE and again in 703, 702 BCE represented something entirely new in anti-imperial warfare: the systematic use of guerrilla tactics, international alliances, and popular support to wear down a superior enemy. Merodach-Baladan was not a traditional king or noble, but rather the leader of the Chaldean tribes that had settled in southern Mesopotamia during the earlier period of political fragmentation. The Chaldeans were related to the Arameans, but had adapted more thoroughly to settled life while maintaining their tribal organization and fierce independence. They controlled the marshy regions around the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, an area that proved ideally suited to guerrilla warfare against conventional armies. When Merodach-Baladan first seized Babylon in 721 BCE, he did so not through a traditional siege or battle, but through a carefully orchestrated political revolution that combined popular discontent with foreign military support. The Babylonians, despite their defeat and occupation, had never truly accepted Assyrian rule. Their ancient pride, cultural sophistication, and religious traditions all worked against integration into the Assyrian system. Merodach-Baladan offered them something the Assyrians never could: leadership that understood and respected Babylonian traditions while possessing the military skill to challenge imperial power. The key to Merodach-Baladan's success lay in his revolutionary approach to alliance building. Instead of relying solely on local support, he reached out to Elam, Assyria's traditional enemy to the east, creating the ancient world's first truly international anti-imperial coalition. The Elamites provided military expertise, financial resources and strategic coordination, while the Babylonian rebels offered local knowledge, popular support, and access to the wealth of Mesopotamia's greatest city. This alliance represented a fundamental shift in how resistance movements operated. Previous rebellions had been largely local affairs, limited by geography and traditional loyalties. Merodach Baladan's coalition transcended these boundaries, creating a network of mutual support that could survive the defeat of any single component. When Assyrian armies threatened Babylon, resistance fighters could retreat to the Elamite mountains. When pressure mounted in Elam, resources and personnel could be shifted to the Mesopotamian marshes. The marshy regions of southern Mesopotamia proved to be Merodach Baladan's greatest strategic advantage. These wetlands, formed by the annual flooding of the great rivers and centuries of irrigation, created a landscape that was nearly impassable for traditional armies, but familiar territory for local inhabitants. Chaldean fighters could move quickly through waterways that would bog down Assyrian chariots and heavy infantry, striking at supply lines and isolated garrisons before disappearing back into the maze of reeds and channels. The Assyrian response to this guerrilla warfare reveals both the strengths and limitations of their imperial system. Sargon II, the Assyrian king who eventually defeated Merodach Baladan's first revolt, recorded his frustration in detailed annals that provide fascinating insights into the difficulties of fighting an unconventional enemy. Assyrian armies, trained for open battle and siege warfare, found themselves struggling against an enemy that refused to engage in traditional combat. Sargon's campaigns against the Chaldean rebels required years of patient effort, gradually draining the marshes, building roads through previously impassable terrain, and establishing a network of fortified posts to control movement and supply. This was expensive, time-consuming work that tied down significant military resources and provided little of the glory or booty that motivated Assyrian soldiers. The annals record several campaigns that claimed victory but failed to achieve lasting results, as Merodach Baladan repeatedly escaped to fight another day. The second revolt, beginning in 703 BCE, proved even more challenging for the Assyrians, because Merodach Baladan had learned from his earlier defeat and refined his tactics accordingly. This time, he focused more heavily on building popular support within Babylon itself, presenting his cause not just as Chaldean independence, but as Babylonian liberation from foreign oppression. He also worked more closely with religious authorities, emphasizing his role as defender of Marduk and traditional Babylonian values against Assyrian cultural imperialism. The ultimate failure of Merodach Baladan's revolts should not obscure their historical significance. These rebellions demonstrated that even the most powerful imperial systems could be challenged by determined resistance movements using appropriate tactics and strategies. They also established patterns of guerrilla warfare, international alliance building, and popular mobilization that would be repeated throughout history whenever smaller powers confronted imperial giants. More immediately, Merodach Baladan's revolts set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most shocking acts of destruction in ancient history. The constant rebellions and the resources required to suppress them had strained Assyrian patience to the breaking point. When Sennacherib became king in 705 BCE, he was determined to end the Babylonian problem once and for all through a demonstration of imperial power so terrible that no one would dare challenge Assyrian authority again. The Great Destruction of Babylon in 689 BCE represents one of history's most calculated acts of cultural vandalism, a deliberate attempt to erase not just a city but an entire civilization from the face of the earth. Sennacherib's revenge revolution went far beyond traditional conquest or even harsh punishment. It was an assault on the very concept of Babylonian identity and the historical memory that sustained it. The destruction began with a siege that lasted for months, as Assyrian engineers systematically cut off all supply routes and escape paths. Unlike previous conflicts where the goal was to capture the city intact, Sennacherib made it clear from the beginning that surrender would not be accepted and no mercy would be shown. The inhabitants were faced with a simple choice: fight to the death or face massacre after the city fell. When Babylon's walls were finally breached, the Assyrian army unleashed a destruction that was methodical in its thoroughness. Every building was systematically demolished, every street was torn up, and every canal was blocked or diverted. But Sennacherib's revenge went even further than physical destruction. He ordered the Euphrates River to be diverted through the ruins of the city, turning the site of ancient Babylon into a swamp where nothing could ever be rebuilt. The psychological warfare aspect of this destruction was just as important as its physical reality. Sennacherib ordered the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god and the symbol of the city's divine protection, to be carried away to Assyria as a war trophy. This act was designed to demonstrate not just Assyrian military superiority, but divine approval for the destruction. In ancient thinking, gods could only be defeated if they willed it, or if they had abandoned their people for some grave sin. The propaganda surrounding Babylon's destruction was carefully crafted to send a message throughout the Assyrian Empire. This is what happens to those who rebel against imperial authority. The king's inscriptions describe the destruction in poetic language, comparing it to a divine flood that washed away sin and corruption. Assyrian artists created relief sculptures showing the city's destruction and the humiliation of its inhabitants, which were displayed in palaces throughout the empire as permanent reminders of imperial power. Archaeological evidence from modern excavations has confirmed many details of Sennacherib's destruction. A massive destruction layer filled with burnt debris and broken artifacts marks the end of the Neo-Babylonian period at sites throughout the city. The systematic nature of the destruction is evident in how even foundations were torn up and scattered, making rebuilding nearly impossible without massive effort. Yet even as Sennacherib celebrated his complete victory over Babylon, the seeds of future rebellion were already being planted. The very thoroughness of the destruction created a powerful symbol of imperial brutality that would inspire resistance for generations to come. More immediately, the elimination of Babylon as a political and economic center created a power vacuum in southern Mesopotamia that other ambitious groups would eventually move to fill. The story of Babylon's resurrection from the ashes of Sennacherib's destruction is one of the most remarkable comeback stories in ancient history. For nearly 60 years, the ruins of the great city lay abandoned, a monument to Assyrian power and a symbol of the futility of resistance to imperial authority. But in 626 BCE, a Chaldean general named Nabopolassar would begin a revolution that would not only restore Babylon to its former glory, but transform it into the capital of an empire that would surpass even Assyrian achievements. Nabopolassar's independence war began not with a dramatic declaration or massive battle, but with a carefully planned series of local uprisings that gradually coalesced into a unified liberation movement. The Chaldean general understood that direct confrontation with Assyrian military might would only lead to another crushing defeat. Instead, he focused on building a broad coalition of all groups that had suffered under Assyrian rule: displaced Babylonians, Chaldean tribes, Aramean settlers, and even Assyrian provincial governors who had grown tired of imperial demands. The key to Nabopolassar's success lay in his understanding that the Assyrian Empire, despite its impressive military reputation, had become dangerously overextended. Constant warfare on multiple frontiers had drained imperial resources and exhausted the professional army that had been the foundation of Assyrian power. Provincial rebellions were breaking out simultaneously across the empire, stretching Assyrian forces thin and making coordinated imperial response increasingly difficult. More importantly, Nabopolassar recognized the revolutionary potential of an alliance with Media, the growing power in the Iranian mountains that had its own reasons for wanting to see Assyrian power broken. The Medes had been subjected to Assyrian raids and tribute demands for decades, and their king Cyaxares was eager to join any coalition that offered a realistic chance of defeating their common enemy. The Babylonian-Median alliance that emerged from these negotiations represented something unprecedented in ancient Near Eastern politics. A true partnership between equals rather than the traditional relationship of dominant and subordinate powers. Both kingdoms contributed military forces, financial resources and strategic expertise to their joint campaigns. This cooperation was formalized through marriage alliances, shared religious ceremonies, and coordinated diplomatic initiatives that presented a united front to the ancient world. The siege of Nineveh in 612 BCE marked the climax of this liberation war and one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in ancient history. Nineveh, the great capital of the Assyrian Empire, had seemed invincible for centuries. Its massive walls, sophisticated defences and strategic location had protected it through countless wars and rebellions. The city's fall sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world and announced that a new era in Near Eastern politics had begun. The details of Nineveh's fall are recorded in the Babylonian Chronicle series, a collection of contemporary documents that provide an invaluable record of these revolutionary events. The chronicles describe how the combined Babylonian and Median armies surrounded the city and cut off all supply routes, gradually starving the defenders into submission. When the walls were finally breached, the destruction was swift and complete, with the Assyrian royal palace burning for days and sending smoke visible for miles across the Mesopotamian plain. The psychological impact of Nineveh's destruction cannot be overstated. For generations, Assyrian military superiority had seemed like a natural law, an unchangeable fact of political life that all other peoples had to accept. Now suddenly, the seemingly invincible empire was collapsing with startling speed. Cities and provinces that had submitted to Assyrian rule for centuries began declaring independence, while former allies distanced themselves from what was clearly a losing cause. But Nabopolassar's revolution went beyond merely defeating the Assyrians. It involved the complete reconstruction of Mesopotamian political and cultural life around Babylonian rather than Assyrian principles. Where the Assyrians had emphasized military conquest and imperial domination, the new Babylonian order stressed cultural achievement, religious devotion, and commercial prosperity. This shift in values would define the character of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and make possible the remarkable flowering of civilization that followed. The evidence for this transformation comes not just from royal inscriptions and official propaganda, but from the thousands of business contracts, legal documents and personal letters that have been discovered in Babylonian archives. These texts reveal a society that was rapidly rebuilding itself according to traditional Babylonian values, while incorporating the best innovations from the broader ancient world. Trade networks were re-established, religious festivals were renewed, and massive construction projects were begun to restore the physical and symbolic glory of Babylon itself. When Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE and was succeeded by his son Nebuchadnezzar II, the stage was set for one of history's most spectacular examples of imperial architecture and cultural achievement. Nebuchadnezzar's reign from 605 to 562 BCE would transform Babylon from a collection of ruins into what many ancient observers considered the most magnificent city in the world, a marvel of engineering, artistry, and urban planning that would be remembered long after the empire itself had fallen. Nebuchadnezzar's imperial revolution began with military campaigns that secured Babylonian dominance over the entire ancient Near East, but it was his building projects that truly established his historical legacy. The king understood that military conquest alone was not enough to create lasting imperial authority. True power required the ability to inspire awe and admiration in both subjects and foreign visitors. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar became a living advertisement for Babylonian civilization, a city so magnificent that it seemed to prove divine favor for its rulers. The most famous of Nebuchadnezzar's architectural achievements were the legendary Hanging Gardens, which ancient writers included among the 7 wonders of the world. While archaeological evidence for these gardens remains elusive, ancient descriptions paint a picture of an engineering marvel that combined advanced hydraulics with sophisticated landscape design. Terraced gardens, rising in pyramid-like stages, were watered by an elaborate system of pumps and channels that brought water from the Euphrates River to heights that seemed to defy natural law. More substantial archaeological evidence exists for the Ishtar Gate, the magnificent ceremonial entrance to Babylon that was decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions, bulls and dragons in brilliant blues, yellows and whites. This gate was not just a defensive structure, but a work of art that announced Babylon's cultural sophistication to all who entered the city. The processional way that led through the gate was equally impressive, lined with relief sculptures and paved with specially made bricks that created patterns visible from the great ziggurat at the city's heart. The Tower of Babel, known to Babylonians as Etemenanki, or House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, represented the ultimate expression of Nebuchadnezzar's architectural ambitions. This massive ziggurat, rising in 7 stages to a height of nearly 300 feet, was visible for miles across the Mesopotamian plain and served as both a religious centre and a symbol of Babylonian power. The tower's construction required advanced engineering techniques, massive labour forces and resources drawn from throughout the empire, but Nebuchadnezzar's revolution extended far beyond impressive buildings to encompass innovations in military technology and strategy that would influence warfare for centuries to come. His perfection of siege warfare techniques made even the strongest fortifications vulnerable to patient and systematic assault. The 13-year siege of Tyre, an island city that had previously been considered impregnable, demonstrated the effectiveness of these new methods and established Babylonian military reputation throughout the Mediterranean world. The deportation of Jerusalem's elite in 586 BCE provides a case study in how Nebuchadnezzar combined military conquest with cultural and religious transformation. When the kingdom of Judah rebelled against Babylonian authority, the king's response was swift and decisive. Jerusalem was besieged, captured and partially destroyed, while its political and religious leadership was transported to Babylon, along with thousands of skilled craftsmen and educated citizens. This Babylonian exile, as it came to be known in Jewish history, was not merely a punishment, but a sophisticated policy designed to integrate conquered peoples into the imperial system while preventing future rebellions. Unlike the Assyrian practice of scattering deportees throughout the empire, Nebuchadnezzar allowed the Jewish exiles to maintain their community identity while exposing them to Babylonian culture and opportunities. Many exiles prospered in their new home, entering government service, establishing successful businesses, and contributing to Babylonian intellectual life. The building revolution that transformed Babylon during Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not limited to spectacular monuments, but encompassed a complete reimagining of urban planning and architecture. The city that emerged from this reconstruction covered over 850 hectares, making it one of the largest urban centres in the ancient world. Its layout followed a sophisticated plan that balanced practical considerations like defence and transportation with aesthetic goals like ceremonial grandeur and religious symbolism. Revolutionary city design under Nebuchadnezzar emphasized both functionality and beauty in ways that had never been attempted before on such a scale. The city was surrounded by massive walls that were wide enough for chariot races on top, while internal districts were organized around specialized functions like government administration, religious activities, commercial trade, and residential neighborhoods. Wide boulevards connected major landmarks and provided space for the religious processions that were central to Babylonian cultural life. The engineering revolution that made this urban expansion possible involved advances in hydraulics and irrigation that pushed ancient technology to its limits. Babylon's location between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided abundant water resources. But channeling and controlling this water for urban use required sophisticated engineering. Networks of canals, reservoirs and aqueducts brought fresh water to every neighbourhood while removing waste and preventing flooding during the annual river floods. Archaeological evidence from German excavations in the early 20th century revealed the extraordinary scale and sophistication of Nebuchadnezzar's building projects. Layer upon layer of construction showed how the city was systematically rebuilt and expanded over decades of intensive work. The quality of materials, precision of construction and integration of artistic decoration with practical function demonstrated a level of urban planning that would not be seen again until the Roman Empire reached its peak. The cultural revolution that accompanied this physical transformation involved the development of a Neo-Babylonian art style that combined traditional Mesopotamian themes with influences from throughout the known world. Babylonian artists working on the king's projects had access to materials, techniques and inspiration from Egypt, Persia, Greece and India. The result was an artistic synthesis that influenced visual culture throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. The economic revolution that supported all of this construction and cultural activity involved innovations in commercial and banking practices that were far ahead of their time. Banking houses like Murasu and Ejibi developed sophisticated credit systems that allowed merchants to finance long-distance trade ventures and major construction projects. These financial innovations made possible the international commerce that brought wealth flowing into Babylon from throughout the known world. Revolutionary trade networks centered on Babylon connected the city with markets from Spain to India, creating the ancient world's first truly global economy. Babylonian merchants established trading posts in major cities throughout the Near East and Mediterranean, while foreign merchants were welcomed in Babylon's markets and provided with legal protections and commercial facilities. This international trade brought not just wealth, but also new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that enriched Babylonian civilization. The agricultural revolution that supported this urban and commercial expansion involved advanced crop rotation and irrigation techniques that maximized productivity while maintaining soil fertility. Babylonian farmers developed new varieties of crops suited to different soil conditions and seasonal patterns, while engineers designed irrigation systems that could supply water to even marginal agricultural lands. The result was agricultural surpluses that could support large urban populations and free labor for non-agricultural activities. Evidence for this economic sophistication comes from the thousands of business contracts and legal documents that have been preserved in Babylonian archives. These texts reveal a complex commercial system involving partnerships, corporations, insurance arrangements, and credit mechanisms that would not seem out of place in a modern economy. The level of record-keeping, legal sophistication, and financial planning demonstrated in these documents shows how far Babylonian commercial practices had advanced beyond simple barter and tribute relationships. As Nebuchadnezzar's long reign drew to a close in 562 BCE, Babylon stood at the pinnacle of ancient achievement. The city had become not just a political capital, but a symbol of human potential, a demonstration of what could be accomplished when military power, economic resources, cultural sophistication, and engineering skill were combined under visionary leadership. Visitors from throughout the known world came to marvel at its wonders and returned home with stories that would inspire legends for centuries to come. Yet even as Babylon reached these heights of glory, the seeds of future change were already being planted. In the mountains of Persia, a new power was rising under Cyrus the Great, who would soon challenge Babylonian dominance and bring this golden age to an end. But the achievements of the Neo-Babylonian Empire would not be forgotten. The architectural innovations, artistic styles, commercial practices, and urban planning techniques developed during this period would influence civilizations throughout the ancient world and beyond. The story of Babylon's rise from the ashes of Assyrian destruction to become the ancient world's greatest city remains one of history's most inspiring examples of resilience, creativity, and human achievement. It demonstrates how military conquest alone cannot create lasting civilization, while cultural achievement, economic prosperity, and architectural grandeur can create legacies that endure long after empires have fallen. In the ruins of ancient Babylon, archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of innovations and achievements that remind us why this city captured the imagination of the ancient world and continues to fascinate us today.